I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Liza Lieberman. I'm Director of Public Policy at Mazon, a Jewish Response to Hunger. And I am joined here with some of my colleagues from our faith community, the Interreligious Working Group on Domestic Human Needs. So this has really been a group effort to get this group together. And it's a very snowy day for many of us in Washington, and I know Minnesota and probably a lot of other places around the country. So thank you all for joining us despite any weather conditions you might be enduring. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. Just in terms of our agenda, we're going to hear from some experts on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, and the Farm Bill. We're also going to talk a little bit about the faith community's response thus far and some directions for how faith communities around the country can take action in this moment. So that, and by the way, when I say faith community, I mean individuals, lay leaders, clergy, whatever context you're calling from. You might be representing an organization or a congregation, or you might be an individual supporter. We are here to equip you all with the resources you need to take action. Many of you are not new to this. Many of you have been working on this for many months and in some cases years, and some of you might just be tuning into this issue and learning about this for the first time. So I just put a little comment in the chat box. Please use that if you can, if you think of any questions that come to mind, or you can hold off. You should all be muted, as I mentioned earlier, and if you want to unmute yourself when we open it up for questions, you can either put your chat in here or you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. So we're going to see how this goes, and hopefully it will be smooth. I also just want to plug from the top, we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the hour. But we have put together an online toolkit for interfaith communities that is going to be a really important tool for all of you after this, especially if you're interested in submitting comments to USDA on this issue. So I just want to preempt a lot of questions. There are going to be answered with that toolkit. If you haven't seen it yet, it has talking points and sample comments that we're going to go through here. So that's a couple housekeeping, and in terms of our agenda, I'm just going to start things off with inviting my colleague and friend, Sister Quincy Howard from Network Lobby for Catholic Justice, to give us some welcoming remarks.
Hi, thank you, Liza. It's good to be here. And thanks for all of the work that everyone is doing. Gracious God, we join together today, mindful of your boundless gifts and keenly aware of the injustices that cause our sisters and brothers to go hungry. We know your will that each and every person who shares in your creation is recognized for their inherent dignity and is held with compassion by the human family. Divine Master, lend us the strength of your presence and the wisdom of your Spirit. Bless our work to remove barriers for meeting human needs and lift up the voices of those in need. Bless our work to soften the heart of a generous nation, for we know that in giving we receive, and that there is a universal holiness in food for the hungry. Help us translate your unconditional love into our national policies so that they reflect the sacred dignity of all people, free of human judgment and penalty. For this we pray. Amen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to walk us through a little bit. Some of you, as I mentioned, are new to this issue. Some of you are not as new to this issue. I'm going to, in a moment, ask my colleague, Josh Protis, to talk a little bit about what brought us to this moment and really talk about the Farm Bill effort that many of you were involved in. I just want to give a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about, though. Basically, when the Farm Bill was signed, the President Trump on February 1st, the official news ran that that there will be a proposed rulemaking through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, for a new rule change to the SNAP program. And what we're going to be talking about is that what this aims to do is really to restrict states' flexibility to provide vital nutrition support to people who struggle to feed themselves, struggle with food insecurity. So this moment that we're catching you in right now, is a 60-day comment period that started on February 1st and will end on April 2nd. So during that time, USDA and the Trump administration is seeking comments from the field, from people who work in food insecurity, people who care about this issue, and that's why we're catching you in this moment, which is a critical time to submit comments. So as a little spoiler alert, at the end of this webinar, we're going to be encouraging you all to submit comments to USDA, and we're going to show you how to do that. I don't want to preempt what Josh is going to be talking about, but as many of you know, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, is really the cornerstone of our nation's nutrition safety net. There's been a lot of discussion about work in the context of the SNAP program. It's important to know, as many of you know from your own communities, that most SNAP recipients who can work do work. So under the current law, any childless, unemployed, or underemployed adult age 18 to 50 is restricted to only 90 days of SNAP benefits within a 3-year window, unless they can prove that they're working or participating in some type of employment and training program for 20 hours per week. So this is actually a very harsh time limit that affects a lot of people and restricts how they can get their benefits. States currently have the flexibility to waive this time limit for communities where they face high unemployment or insufficient jobs. So my colleague Christine from Bread for the World is going to talk a little bit more about this. But basically what we see is that the USDA is trying to severely limit this critically important flexibility. And by the way, this is utilized by the majority of states. I'm actually going to take a moment, if I can figure out how to do this, to show you all this tool. So this is the proposed rule that ran on February 1st. This is a snapshot from the Federal Register. So it ran, and as is common with the Federal Register, there's a comment period. So what ran was a notice for proposed rulemaking. And then there's a comment period for the public to weigh in on the issue, and then they will theoretically put through a final rule. So I wanted to show you this map, and this relates to a website that was put together by our colleagues at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. This shows that most states, almost all states actually, every state except Delaware, at some point has used the state flexibility option in some point in the past 2 decades. So this actually, I don't know if I can show you, but it's a slider tool, and I'll circulate the link to this certainly. You can see over the course of the last 2 decades what states have used the state flexibility. The orange that you see there is an area that was covered by these waivers. So these are areas that were facing insufficient jobs, facing high unemployment, and the state understood their population enough to issue waivers so that these people wouldn't be restricted to their SNAP benefits. So this is really important to note. It has varied over time. I'm sorry I can't show you the sliding feature right now, but you can see that in 2000 it looked much different than in 2005, which looked different than 2010, and which it looks different than now. So you'll be able to see that, and actually I think I can put a link on the chat feature so you can all look at that in real time as well. So that's really important to see. What else? So there's a 60-day comment period. And as I mentioned, our call to action right now is to submit unique comments to USDA between now and between now and April 2nd. So we're going to talk more about the resources that we've put together to help you do that. But first, I want to kick it off to my colleague Josh Protas, Mazone's Vice President of Public Policy, to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill and the SNAP program in general. Josh?
Great. Thank you so much, Liza. And thanks to everybody who's on the webinar today. Many of you were deeply engaged in the Farm Bill reauthorization process. And just to put this proposed rulemaking into context about the Farm Bill, and as many of you know, the Farm Bill is typically a 5-year reauthorization. The slide up on screen is a quote from President Obama that I think accurately reflects the Farm Bill. It's like a Swiss Army knife. It is a broad, multi-jurisdictional reauthorization package that covers everything from most of our major nutrition assistance programs to crop insurance, research, conservation, innovation, infrastructure and rural development, jobs. There's a little bit of everything for everyone in the Farm Bill, and Farm Bill really touches all parts of American life. The reauthorization process for this Farm Bill was a long and contentious process. The 2014 Farm Bill was the last time it was reauthorized, and it was actually due to expire in September of 2018. Congress failed to reauthorize it in sufficient time, but they were able to finally get it done before having to do a short-term extension. Congress worked very, very hard in this reauthorization process, and want to note that this Farm Bill passed with historic margins of bipartisan support. So in the Senate, it passed by a margin of 87-13, and in the House of Representatives, 369 votes for and 47 votes opposed. No farm bill in recent memory has enjoyed that kind of broad support and bipartisan support. And I mention that because there were a lot of careful deliberations about getting this farm bill done and a lot of compromises and bipartisan cooperation to make that happen. When the final farm bill was signed into law, as Liza mentioned, in December, on that same day, the President Trump signed the farm bill into law. The USDA announced its intention about this proposed rulemaking. So what's very important to note is that this provision that would restrict states' flexibilities about seeking waivers from work requirements was not included in the final farm bill. So Congress debated this topic, among other topics having to do with some harmful provisions to SNAP that ultimately were not included. So the Trump administration is doing an end run around Congress. They're circumventing the congressional intent that was clearly expressed in the final farm bill. And this is deeply concerning, both because it is ignoring the intent of Congress. It is seeking to limit states' flexibilities, and states really know their populations best. And as Liza showed on that map, they've utilized these waiver requests, knowing that there are communities within their states that have really struggled to have adequate employment and people who are struggling. So they've utilized this key flexibility that would be eliminated by this proposed rule. It's important to note also that SNAP is first and foremost a job security program. It's not a catalyst for workforce development. There are employment and training provisions in the Farm Bill that are connected to the SNAP program, but that's not fundamentally what the program exists for. And further, it's important to note that in the 2014 Farm Bill, there were 10 pilot programs for SNAP employment and training programs that were created. We have yet to see the results from those SNAP ENT pilot programs. We're expecting those sometime in the next year or so. And this proposed rule is trying to leapfrog that process. So the 2018 Farm Bill that just passed made some further investments in employment and training to build on the successes of these pilot programs once we have learned the best practices and what's been effective. But this proposed rule doesn't take any of that into account. If the intention is to help people move back into the workforce, we could do better to invest more in employment and training and create more job opportunities. This proposed rule really doesn't seek to do that. It seeks to limit the access to SNAP and take away state flexibilities in a very calculated and callous manner that is deeply disturbing, and I would say is really a moral issue. And I think that's why we're all here too, because the faith community voice really has an important aspect to add to the moral dimensions of this. So unfortunately, this proposed rule is not the only proposed rule that the faith community and others have had to contend with, and it won't be the last either. So I'm going to turn things back over, I guess, to Liza, and then we'll hear more about other proposed rules to give a little context.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. That was a perfect segue. I'm gonna now turn the microphone, I guess, over to my colleague Laura Peralta-Schulte, Senior Government Relations Advocate at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. Laura took a leadership role in, I think, what was the most recent public charge campaign, which was another proposed rule that she will tell you all about, and I think many of you already know. And I think there were some important lessons learned that we can apply to this, this current comment period. So Laura?
Yeah, thank you so much, Liza. And I just want to echo what Josh just said. This isn't the first time that the administration has tried to make an end run around Congress, and it will certainly not be the last. What we know is the administration had tried to achieve its goal of adopting rigid work requirements and changing categorical eligibility rules through legislation and failed, thankfully. Now they are pivoting to do what has really become their pattern, try to achieve the same goals through administrative rules. So this was true after Congress failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act. This is true after their plans to restrict immigration and refugee protections failed through Congress. And now it's true once again after advocates like you worked with Congress to pass a very good farm bill that protects access to food. Now, the good news is we have experience fighting back. Our community has a record of doing what it takes to help the most vulnerable. And I do think that our recent experience with generating comments on public charge was a great example. So at the beginning of that campaign, we had a goal. We had a goal to generate 100,000 comments against the rule. And a group existed just like a group exists now with the leadership of Maison and Brett and others, as well as our secular partners, to generate the materials that we need to make a difference. So those materials are ready. You're about to hear about them, but this is really our call into action. So there is a deep power in our community. Faith partners and individuals during the public charge campaign were able to make a huge impact in the overall collection of comments on that rule. We focused and we got the job done. We had temples and we had churches holding postcard writing campaigns at the local level. We had faith organizations writing comments, capturing our expertise as it relates to our groups. And again, echoing Josh, we made the moral case for why public charge is wrong for our country. Just like in that campaign, we are now prepared to work because we know the individuals who suffer from food insecurity. We know their lived reality, and we have an obligation to share their stories, to make the request, and to speak our truth. So in the end, on the public charge campaign, we generated over 250,000 comments. All organizations with a lot of work in our community specifically stepped up and stepped in. So I think we have a track record. Let's do it again, and let's make sure that we are helpful in terms of ensuring that our most vulnerable friends continue to receive the food that they need for body and for health. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. So I think there are some lessons learned. It's an incredible effort that the public charge campaign was able to generate hundreds of thousands of comments. I think we would love to see that again. It can get a little wonky, this issue, but I think that as we'll discuss, some of the most important information that we can provide to USDA, and in many cases remind them, is the stories of the people that will actually be hurt by this. Many of you are on the ground working in those communities. You know who shows up at the food pantries. You know who relies on SNAP, and you know the real impact that this would have on your communities. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Christine Melendez-Ashley, Deputy Director of Government Relations at Bread for the World, to talk a little bit more about who will be harmed by this proposed rule change and the impact that this could have. Christine?
Great, thanks, Liza. And there's definitely, I think they talked a little bit already about exactly how this rule would work, but I'll just go over a little bit about who exactly is going to be impacted if this rule were to go through. So by USDA's own estimate, who are the folks who put this rule out there, changing SNAP in this way would result in about 770,000 or more people actually losing benefits. So who are these people? Like was mentioned earlier, under current law, if you're an adult between 18 and 49 and you don't have any dependents or children at home, you're really really limited to those 3 months of SNAP benefits in a 3-year period if you're not working at least 20 hours a week. So work training, of course, counts towards that, but states aren't required to provide work training. And but unfortunately, searching for a job doesn't count towards that requirement, which is pretty harsh. So because of the understanding that those are some harsh limits, states have been able to waive that requirement, especially when the economy is bad or jobs are lacking or unemployment's high. So as was mentioned, nearly every state in the country has waived this rule at some point over the last 20 years. These waivers were instituted on a bipartisan basis and have been used under both Democrat and Republican administrations. So there's a long history of bipartisanship here. But if we think about who really is in this category or this group of people who would be impacted, typically folks who fall into this category are among the poorest of the poor. The average income of these folks, according to USDA, is just 33% of the poverty line. And for anyone who knows what the federal poverty line is, you know how tight that is. For just a single person, for one person, the poverty level in 2018 was a little bit more than $12,000 a year. If you can do some math with me, a third of that is only about $4,000 a year in income. So really just barely enough to, not even enough to live on for sure. So limiting waivers in the way that's being proposed would just really hurt individuals who are maybe between jobs, workers who maybe they are working, but they just can't reach that 20-hour minimum a week. And it would especially impact people who face just these really big barriers to employment. So when you think about who are those who really struggle to access the workforce or to be in the workforce, it's adults that don't have more than a high school education. It's people in rural areas. It's people of color. These individuals, they really have higher than average unemployment rates and underemployment rates, and they would disproportionately be impacted by this new rule. And so we hear all the time this argument that, well, it's okay because churches and charities can just make up the difference. They don't need to be on SNAP. And we all know that that's really not a fair representation of reality. Federal nutrition programs provide at least 10 times, if not more, food assistance than churches and charities. And most folks who are providing food for their communities know that they're already stretched thin and would struggle to meet this need. And as Laura was talking about, this rule is not happening in isolation. So if this isn't the only group of folks who would be impacted moving forward if the administration has its way. And so we know that 700 and some thousand might not sound like a lot compared to millions, but it's still, for those individuals, it's very real, the impact that would happen on them and the struggle that they would have to put food on the table. So so I think that's why our voices really are so important as people of faith. Since, like Liza mentioned, we know what's happening in our communities and serving those folks, and making sure that everyone has enough to eat is not just the church or charity's role, and it's not just the government's role. It is a partnership, and they really help support each other. So I'll stop there and happy to answer questions whenever appropriate moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that is a great reminder. I wanted to remind everyone to please send any questions through the chat function. We can also, this might be a good time to pause for a moment. If anyone has questions for Josh, Laura, Christine, or I about the information we've covered so far, about the basics of the proposed rule change, how we got here with the Farm Bill, the general context of SNAP, and how SNAP works and the currently existing work requirements and time limits. Any questions? As a reminder, if you want to ask a question live, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. Any questions? While you're thinking, I just wanted to highlight a couple things that Christine said. Another category of people that this proposed rule change will affect that we're really concerned about is that it would severely impact veterans who often face unique challenges in securing full-time work And unfortunately, many veterans are participating in the SNAP program. And in many cases, they may require more than 3 months to secure employment. So that's just one. It's worth noting that I think, particularly within the Farm Bill context in the last few years, some politicians and some people in our communities perhaps speak about this group of childless adults age 18 to 49 in really derogatory ways that I think is really concerning to a lot of us, particularly in the faith community. And this is another area where we might be able to discuss how we talk about these people in our communities, and it makes it sound like they're this monolithic community, which is absolutely not true. They fail to realize that in many cases, there just aren't proper opportunities in the community for work, either appropriate jobs for people with their skills or sufficient training programs so that they can learn new skills. So I just wanted to highlight that within Christine's remarks. All right, one more call for any questions.
Yes, what is the reason the administration is giving for having this rule?
Josh, I saw you smile. Maybe you wanna take that one.
Sure. So the stated reason, let's see if I have the language here. I mean, it's ostensibly about increasing self-sufficiency, well-being, and economic mobility. And I think that's predicated on this notion, and I would say it's a wrong-headed notion, that SNAP benefits are lulling people into a false sense of complacency, and that people are not going out into the workforce because of the average benefit amount of $1.40 per person per meal. I don't know of anybody who would forego a work opportunity for $4.50 per day. That's not enough to live on, but this administration seems to think that that generous SNAP benefits are keeping people out of the workforce. I think reading between the lines, this is really intended to try and reduce SNAP rolls. It's partly motivated by an idea that our federal government is too large as it is, and an intention to try and shrink the size of federal programs, in particular welfare programs, and that's in air quotes, that some see as just giving a hand out to people who are not deserving. And I think, again, I think some of the motivation for this is a division between those who are the deserving poor and those who are the undeserving poor, which I think is extremely problematic. So if the real intention is to try and help people get back to work, there are plenty of ways that the administration could address that, including directing more resources towards job creation and employment and training programs, learning what the best practices really are from the employment and training program pilots from the 2014 Farm Bill. But that's not the direction that this administration has gone. So my read on this is that, that there's a nefarious intent behind this proposed rule that is really aimed more at reducing the SNAP rolls and cutting the program more than really helping the people who need that assistance.
Thanks, Josh. Anyone have something to add? Okay.
Well, I had a question specifically about the elderly recipients of food help. What percentage are elderly, Medicare age, let's say, and are there other options that are available to the elderly that are not available to people who are younger, all these other categories, veterans and rural and poorly educated and such?
Sure. So I'm happy to give some basics, and then if Christine or others want to jump in. So actually, in terms of SNAP in general, I think it's over 2/3 of SNAP participants are children, elderly adult, older Americans, elderly, or people with disabilities, and therefore those populations are not subject to the currently existing work requirements, so they don't have this time limit of how often they can receive SNAP benefits. So what we're talking about, this proposed rule change would really affect these childless people without dependents that are age 18 to 49 that are not reporting 20 hours of work per week or employment and training. So it's a little more narrow than anyone who receives SNAP. Now, within that 1/3 of the people who can be working, most are working. Not all, of course, can report the hours as the government would like to see, but most are working. Christine, do you want to talk a little bit about the other programs that are available for older Americans as well?
Sure. I mean, I think generally, if my memory serves correct, that older Americans participate in SNAP at lower rates than they're probably eligible for. So I think that trying to connect more folks in that age range with benefits is definitely one possible thing to try to address food insecurity there. But another program that is actually targeted at older Americans is the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, which is more of a food box type program that I believe is operating now nationwide or nearly nationwide, and has grown over the last several years to meet more needs. So that's another option that's available for older Americans. But like Liza said, this specific proposal is really impacting that kind of ages 18 to 49 range of individuals who don't have dependents at home.
Did that answer the question? I hope so. Quick reminder to please enter any questions you have also into the chat box. That's another way we can answer your questions. So I think I'm going to shift now and introduce my next colleague to chat about the importance of faith voices. And we're going to shift to kind of more of the call to action portion of the webinar and the importance of your voices in making the case for why this rule should not go through. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Diane Randall, who is Executive Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Diane?
Thank you, Liza, and thanks to all my colleagues on this call, those of us working in Washington, D.C., advocating for smart choices that help build communities and build opportunities for people, such as the SNAP program. But I really want to thank people who are joining us from around the country, both for your participation today, but also for your advocacy on behalf of the Farm Bill and the SNAP provisions, and for your willingness to participate in submitting comments to the USDA on this regulation, this new rule, proposed rule. I want to talk for a minute as a friend, as a Quaker. We believe there is that of God in every person. It is a concept that is shared by many faiths, that we honor the human dignity of individuals, which means that we are called to recognize their most basic needs and work to serve those basic needs. And many churches and faith organizations are doing that all across this country. They're doing it in providing support, food support, providing shelter, providing housing. Many people of faith work with those who are very vulnerable. And I think the message that you've heard from my colleagues here today is how this proposed rule change would really be harmful to those who are most vulnerable. I can tell you that in our advocacy, talking to members of Congress, they look to people of faith. They look to church leaders, people coming from local communities and houses of worship, who can tell the stories both of what our faith teaches us about serving the least of these, but also who can tell the stories of the real people in local communities who are harmed by policies such as this rule that would prevent access to people who need food. And so I urge you who are considering, who work with those who need and use SNAP benefits to submit a written comment. And you'll be hearing more about exactly how to do this. Numbers matter. So the numbers of written comments that we can get in, such as were described by Laura in another issue where we tried to, where we got thousands and thousands of written comments submitted, these numbers matter. So it's very important for us over the next 6 weeks to submit as many comments as possible to the USDA on this proposed rule and the harmful aspects of it. Tell the stories of people in your communities, the need, the benefits that they see from using SNAP and the harm that would come from not having that available. colleagues shared how our houses of worship, how faith communities are not able to meet the need alone. There is a mistaken idea that charity can substitute for the type of vital government assistance that we have come to rely on in so many ways throughout this country. This is only one of them. And so I have to say that as someone who has worked for a long time in the area of economic justice, I really struggle with the idea that there is such a thing as a deserving poor person and an undeserving poor person. The fact is that we are all deserving of God's love. We are all deserving of living in communities where every person's potential may be fulfilled. But if people are hungry, there's no way they can do, they can't work. They can't survive adequately. And I think one of the lessons here is those of you who have worked with people who are extremely poor or have encountered people who are very poor know that in many cases, the people live lives that are somewhat chaotic. They may not have transportation. They may not have adequate education. They may be suffering from some sort of illness. They may have some family disunion. And so the ability for them to work in the way that this proposed rule is asking is simply not possible. So cutting off their food benefits because of that is mean. It's mean and it's cruel, and it is beneath who we are as a people. And so raising our voices, whether Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Baha'i or Buddhist, is just essential for us to share these stories in this proposed rule change, to submit comments. And I want to go a step further and say, particularly because many of you have been in contact with your members of Congress, when you submit the rule, and you'll learn how exactly to, when you submit a comment around this proposed rule, I urge you to send a copy of that comment to your elected official. Let them know how much you care about this and how meaningful it is to you that these changes not be put in place. So I just want to reiterate that time and time again, when we go into the offices of members of Congress, to the people who are in decision-making bodies, they look for diversity of opinions. They look for how what they are doing affects people at a very local level. So getting stories from Nebraska and from South Dakota and from California and from New York and from every state makes a difference. So please encourage your colleagues to submit letters, encourage your family, your friends, anyone who has a story to share and is willing to raise their voice on trying to prevent this proposed rule from going into place would be very welcome. And thank you for your participation and your advocacy.
Thank you very much, Diane. I just want to plug one more time the Interfaith Toolkit that is, I think all of you should have received it with the materials for this webinar, and I will also make sure that it is circulated afterwards. That toolkit is really going to be your one-stop shop for how to take action on this. So I'm going to show you the instructions for how to take action. So this is a photo that you see here of what the Federal Register, the regulations.gov website looks like. And there's a link to this in your Interfaith Toolkit. And basically when you go there, you'll be able to submit your comments in the text box, or you can submit a file as well. So when you go to our Interfaith Toolkit, which I will send you, you'll have a link to this, and you'll also see template comments. So the resources that we have some talking points, many of which we've gone over today about how many people would be hurt by this, how it actually would not help anyone get back to work, etc. The next page that you'll see is a sample comment, which is obviously you'll need to tailor it and you'll need to fill in information about your own community, but this it has the contact information of who it should be addressed to and all of that. So you have some highlighted sections for where you're going to tailor your letter, and as we've been discussing, it's very important that your comment is unique to your voice and your community, your state in many cases. They can't all be identical comments. They will understand what's happening and they will catch on. And we all have really interesting and unique things to say and angles about why we care about this issue. Some of the other materials we have in here, we have a sign-on letter that national faith-based organizations right now are endorsing. We have about, I think, almost 20 organizations signed on already, many of which you've heard from today. Interfaith organizations that have signed on to these pretty basic principles. The general gist is that we oppose this and we don't think it will actually work, and it will not get towards the goals that they're working towards. So that could be helpful for you to see which national organizations that you might align with or know of, which organizations are on record on this issue and standing with us in this coalition. The next page that I think is going to be really interesting for many of you is faith leader quotes. Some from, I think Diane is one of them, some others from Bread for the World, Mazone, also our partners in the Episcopal Church, Faith in Public Life Network, Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, United Methodist Church, Islamic Relief, many others. Talking about the importance of protecting and strengthening SNAP, both in the context of the Farm Bill, which Josh mentioned we've just been through, and also in the context of any administrative attacks. So you can certainly read those for inspiration or context. You can also pull some of those out if you find them particularly meaningful. The next page that I wanted to talk about is some textual perspectives. So we've pulled out some text both from Jewish teachings, Muslim teachings, and Christian teachings as well. So this is when we talk about our scripture and our values lead us to do this work. I mean, I don't have to tell many of you that is very important for many of us to be able to point directly to our holy scriptures and see where it tells us to do this. That oftentimes aligns with our values as well. So I'll let you all look through those. But this is this concept of social justice and helping our brothers and sisters is quite universal, I would say. The next section of the toolkit is social media posts. So that's going to be really important for getting the word out to your community members and others around the country to really make sure people are aware that this comment period is a time limited, just a few weeks left to submit comments, as Diane mentioned, and as Laura talked about with the public charge rule, as many comments as possible are going to be really critical in sending a strong message that we oppose this rule. And then we have the additional resources of the text of the proposed rule, the Federal Register website where you can submit your comments, and then some more information, background information on SNAP, state-specific information as well. A couple other notes about crafting your comments, which again is the most immediate request. We've talked about how important it is that your comment is unique. I would add it's important to maybe in one of the very first lines say very clearly, I or we oppose this rule. We urge you to rescind or rethink this approach. It is not going to work. That needs to be at the beginning of your comment, very clearly said. When possible, I think it would be great to include data about local charities and federal assistance programs that are offered in your own community that you may work with, you may know of, kind of talk about the local impact of how this is really helping people's lives. And then in the same vein, how this would really hurt people if it were to go through. Maybe your community, maybe there have been recent press pieces about high unemployment or lack of jobs, things like that, to bring in that local angle is going to be very helpful. And then, of course, stories are invaluable. That is probably one of the most repeated lines on Capitol Hill, I think, and with the U.S. government. We talk about millions of people, 775,000 people. Those are huge numbers we can talk about all the time, but until you hear a story about how this would actually impact someone, sometimes those numbers feel very vague. So I encourage you all to go out and seek those stories. You might know of them in your own communities. They might be your own story, frankly. So tell those stories as much as you are comfortable. And then the second part, I would say, is to encourage your friends and community members, practitioners, clergy to submit comments. Clergy will be very impactful because they represent a community in many cases. So that is is going to be very helpful. I would say also people who are working with the food pantries. That's another angle we can talk about. Someone who can talk about a recent experience with the recent government shutdown. That's another very interesting angle. Legal service providers, perhaps small businesses that can speak to this. Anyone else you can think of, as many people as possible who can tell a unique story and submit this comment is going to be very critical. I'm just looking as I'm talking at some of the questions that are coming in. I agree that it was an incredibly powerful and effective idea to send a copy of your comment to your congressional representatives. I will gladly add that to the toolkit. I think that is a really great suggestion. So thank you for that, Diane. Include pictures of those holding signs asking for food. That's an interesting suggestion. I actually hadn't thought of that. I don't know if the regulations.gov website will be able to receive pictures, but potentially if you're submitting a PDF, that might be a possibility. So that's another great idea. Any other questions that haven't come in through the chat box that anyone wants to ask at this point? Do any of my colleagues, my fellow panelists, have anything they would like to add or questions they would like to ask of each other? Yes, I will be circulating the link to the toolkit. It should be on the flyer that you might have received for this webinar. I think it was embedded in there, and I will absolutely send it afterwards as well. Yes, you're welcome, Sarah. Any other questions?
Yes, hi, this is, my name is Bushra Islam.
Hello.
Hi. So my question is, thank you so much for the beautiful, presentation, and I really learned a lot. And thank you for taking the step, showing the concern for the, fellow Americans. So I'm a member. I know I go to different mosques and part of different faith-based organizations also, and my passion is food security. I also work as a dietitian at a veterans hospital. So there's another concern that I have for the veterans who are, in a really sad situation. So do you suggest that, me personally, I should reach out to as many, Islamic community centers, Muslim faith-based organizations to write a comment? To send a comment, so as many comments would be better?
Absolutely, yeah. And the number of comments is going to be critical. So if you submit a comment and your colleagues submit comments, you might have similar things to say, but you might have unique aspects or different things you want to pull out about why you care about this issue. So yes, as many comments as possible. That is our call to action. And again, it's a good reminder that those comments are due through the regulations.gov website by April 2nd. So they have to be received, I think it's by midnight, but hopefully well before that on April 2nd.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I got a question about a list of legislators for each state. I assume you mean congressional legislators for who to send that to. If so, that information can be found on house.gov. You can just enter in your state or your zip code and find out who your member of Congress is, both House and Senate. I can put that link into the chat box. Any other questions? Yeah, and Marge Clark, thank you very much for reminding us that, and thank you, Sammy, Thank you for reminding us that comments and letters from individuals or individual accounts and the number of unique comments is going to be more valuable than sign-on letters. That's absolutely correct. We do have a sign-on letter for national faith-based organizations. We're encouraging every national faith-based organization who signs this letter to also submit a unique comment, but we thought that was helpful to have everyone on record, in particular for faith communities, to be able to see the coalition that has come together around this, but we are encouraging every organization to also do their own comments. Any other questions? Okay, hearing none, I hope you all have my contact information that you probably received this webinar information from. I will also put that on the last slide. Here we go. So the toolkit will be available at bit.ly/faith4snap. I will redirect that very shortly after we end here. And also I've included both my contact information and Christine at Bread for the World contact information if you have any questions about submitting your comment or contacting your legislator or any further action needed. We're here to help. We are very, very pleased that you joined us this afternoon. With that, I'm going to hand things off for some closing thoughts to my colleague, Amelia Keegan, also with Friends Committee on National Legislation. Amelia.
Thank you, Liza, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Wow, it's been a really, I think, rich conversation, gotten a lot of great materials, and I hope everyone will check out the toolkit that Liza referenced. You know, there is so much in the news these days, right? And there's so much bad news, especially, and a lot in this world and in this society that really feels out of control. But we know as people of faith that God is at work in the most darkest of moments, right? In the most broken of places. And we are invited to be his hands and feet in this work. So in the face of so much that is beyond our control, so much we may feel outraged by, that we may disagree with, this is something very concrete that we can do right now, something that can make a huge difference. And DHN and all of the organizations that are a part of this coalition, Mazone, Network, FCNL, Bread for the World, and so many others, we're all here to kind of help you and support you in this work. We have these resources, and we really hope that you will reach out and take advantage of this opportunity to make your voices heard. As Josh said, so many of you were instrumental in advocating to protect SNAP in the Farm Bill, and that was a major victory. But we know that faith-based advocacy is not a short-term affair, right? Social justice advocacy is a long-term relationship. It is a calling. It takes a commitment towards that prophetic vision, towards the world we seek and the kingdom of God. Our efforts to protect SNAP and moreover to push for that end to hunger and food insecurity in our country and around the world, those don't end with the passage of a bill. Social justice advocacy is a long-term relationship. So before us lies this next opportunity to make our voices heard. The more comments we submit, the more we get our friends, our family members, our fellow congregants to submit more comments, the more effective we'll be. We'll help delay the process, and we can also help set the record for litigation later on. This is a moral issue. But this can also be a winning issue. It is an issue where we must speak up, and it is an issue where I think we can win on this. In Luke, God takes away Zechariah's voice because of his lack of faith. Well, we have our voices, and we have faith. So let's continue to push forward that vision of justice, that vision of righteousness towards that world we think, towards that world we seek. Thank you all for your persistent and consistent advocacy. I hope this has been helpful to you and you will take advantage of the resources that we have all talked about here. I want to thank all of our amazing speakers, and I wish you all a good rest of the afternoon, and hope you will reach out if there's anything that any of us can do to help you in your advocacy and your work.
Thanks very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.